Hey guys, and welcome back to AP Biology. So in our first lecture, we went over all the standards, the new format of the exam. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do our first lecture, lesson number 2, on natural selection. A lot of biologists believe that in order to understand biology, you should take ecology and evolution before you start doing all the other stuff with genetics and taxonomy. And so that's why we're going to start off with our favorite, evolution. Okay, more books have been written about evolution than any other topic. I mean, if you go into the bookstore, you'll see just books after books. And especially on this man right here. This is Charles Darwin. Now, a lot of people think he invented evolution or discovered it, and that's not 100% accurate. Actually, Charles Darwin was the first to find a mechanism to explain evolution, and this is where natural selection comes in. And so that's the title of today's lecture. So let's take a look. So before we even understand this, we should see who came before Darwin and before he came up with his mechanism for natural selection. And so we have Carlos Linnaeus, Hutton, Lamarck, Malthus, Cuvier, Lyell. Now the new AP exam isn't going to have you memorize this. However, the bigger your science background, the better this will be. And you never know when these names could come in handy. Okay, and so when we start off with the first one, when we start off with the first one, Linnaeus was the guy who came up with the taxonomic scheme: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Hutton comes up with gradualism, and he mentions that evolution is a slow and steady process. Lamarck is one of the guys who came up with a theory but didn't quite carry on. In other words, his theory was disproven by Wallace and by Darwin. Malthus is the first to say that the carrying capacity is a big deal. He's the first to understand that resources one day will run out, and that perhaps the human population will reach its carrying capacity too, because whether you know it or not, we are still growing exponentially. Cuvier was the paleontologist. He was famous for all his fossil evidence, and so all this compounded with some uniformitarianism. Now, big word, what uniformitarianism means is that basically whatever happened a long time ago is still happening today. Earthquakes back then, earthquakes today. So anything we see today, we have to assume it occurred then too. And then, of course, there's Darwin. Mendel, we know Mendel about its genetics, right? He's the father of heredity. And then, of course, afterward was also Wallace. Okay, so let's also take a look. So just in terms of sedimentary rock forms whenever sediments start piling up on top of each other. This is one of the best rocks to preserve fossils, okay, because it keeps them compact, it keeps them covered, and if it's a quick burial, you'll sure enough be able to identify your fossil. More so, the layers. The layers are so important because they give us a series of ages. Like, we can compare, in case there's like a landslide or some sort of fault shift, we can still compare the layers and understand that time was still the same on those layers. Okay, so just bring up Cuvier here from 1769 to 1832. He's the guy who says, okay, events in the past occurred suddenly, and he's the gradualism guy, right? Caused by mechanisms different from those operating in the present, okay? Were they the same? Yes. And then in ways they were different because we did have a reducing atmosphere. There was no oxygen on Earth. Okay, Charles Lyell, mechanisms of change are constant over time, and so definitely we see that. As we said, what happened before happens now. Rocks still sediment the same way. All right, now Lamarck. Lamarck was the giraffe guy. What he basically said was that traits are acquired. Okay, so anything that was acquired, you could pass that on to your offspring. This doesn't make sense though, because any change that we acquire, let's say I learn a new language, or I don't know, I get a nose job. If I were to do those things, I couldn't pass that on to my kids because it's not in our DNA. Now, genetics was a far out thing. Nobody was talking about DNA. People knew a little bit there was some sort of information being passed on, but what was it? We didn't know this hereditary material. And so this was the theory that was accepted by many scientists all over the world. However, it was disproven. It was disproven by a man named August Weismann, who took a group of mice and were cutting their tails off. Then he let them mate and reproduce, and the babies all had tails. Hey, if Lamarck was correct, those babies shouldn't have been born with tails. So he said, let's just be careful and do it again. Chop their tails off, let them heal, let them mate. Babies came out with tails again. And this went on for 22 generations. And so this became a big deal, all right, that Lamarck's theory was disproven, and now we're open for new ideas. What else is out there? In addition, scientists were skeptical about his use and disuse theory. Lamarck mentioned that if you use it, then you keep it. If you don't, you lose it. And actually, that's not the case. It's very inaccurate. We have parts on our body called vestigial organs that we really don't use anymore. For example, our appendix, our tonsils. In this picture, we actually see a whale that has a little bit of a bone. Okay, now what is that little bone still doing there? Was there a time when this thing was a tetrapod, where they had 4 legs, where they got to walk on land? The theory is, since this whale can breathe air, give birth to live young, and milk them like mammals, it's probably a good guess that the whale started life out on land. Made its way from the water, became a mammal, and then eventually went back into the water where there was plenty of room. All right, now our wonderful guy Darwin. Here is the path that he took. So starting out over here at Plymouth in England, okay, we're moving on, and he goes through South America. Right around here are the Galapagos Islands, where a big significant piece of his research was done. But don't get me wrong, he also was stopped over here at Hobart, Australia, King George Sound. He's seen some of the wackiest organisms that anybody had ever seen over there in Australia. Remember, he was a naturalist, which meant he studied nature. He was only 16 years old, maybe spending about 8 to 10 years on the boat and coming back as a man. Okay, and then this is his theory. So basically, if you know these 5 points of natural selection, you should have no problem on the AP exam. So first is overproduction. In order to have change over time, like evolution, we have to first understand that more offspring need to be produced than actually survive. The reason for this is there's winners and losers in evolution, right? When you play the game of evolution, you either live or you reproduce and and live on, right? You either live or die. Variation. Every single organism is different from the other in a sexually reproducing population. Variation is the hallmark of evolution. This is where we actually have differences amongst them, and when there's differences, one is always going to be better than the other. There's limited resources. Eventually the food is going to run out. Eventually the mates are going to run out. And so we want to keep that in mind as well. Not to mention competition. If we think about competition, this is possibly the driving force for evolution. Without competition, there is no winner. There is no better organism more adapted. And then finally, survival of the fittest. In the sense where when we talk about relative fitness for evolution, we're talking about the organism that reproduces the most offspring, the most healthy, viable offspring, the most fertile offspring. And if your offspring produce offspring, then you are even more fit. So when they ask which is most fit, we're picking the one with the most offspring, not the strongest, not the healthiest. Okay, somebody can have cancer and have like 20 kids. That's the fittest. Got it? Bam. All right, overproduction. I just wanted to show you here how it's probably possible that all these Rottweilers aren't going to survive. All right, the youngest or the runt of the litter usually dies off, and you never get them all to survive. In addition, this puffball. Now, you can't see it, but if you looked up close with a microscope, you would see tiny little spores. Each one of those spores has the ability to produce a new puffball. And so this is huge, okay? So definitely with overproduction, there's like millions, billions of spores it's reproducing. How many puffballs? I bet you like only a dozen will actually survive and become an adult like this one. Look at the variation in this population. I got to show you this because no two ladybugs or ladybird beetles are exactly the same. They all have different dot patterns. Now, if you stare at this close enough, you will not find two beetles identical to each other. All right, I remember hearing about a guy named Kinsley, and he used to collect gall wasps. He was one of the sex doctors. He was like an educationalist on sex. Well, anyway, before that, he was studying gall wasps, and he noticed after collecting 1 million of them, he would collect one, put it on a pin, put it in a Ziploc bag in a file. He had over 1 million. Once he reached 1 million, he even said it. One thing I noticed was that no two were the same after looking at 1 million of them under the microscope. So it's a big deal. Variation must be. And then there you have it, right? So now descent with modification, one of the only organisms that we have a full fossil record for is the elephant, okay? And the horse. So here's just what we call a phylogenetic tree, where we have a very important word comes the common ancestor. Anywhere there's a branch, we have a common ancestor that branches out. Now, if they didn't make it to today, which only 2 did, that means they went extinct. The mammoth, the mastodon, okay, this guy over here at the Pliocene era, and so forth. Okay, looking even closer, yes, it's the only one with a complete fossil record, but I tend to like to look at what are the adaptations. Sometimes on the AP exam, they could show you an adaptation. Like, for example, at one point, the elephant had like hooks coming out of his chin. We believe that maybe he was a ground eater, right? He was digging with those things, right? Then the tusks moved up, and they became better as defense against other elephants and other herbivores that might try to, steal their resources. Okay, here's the horse. Now, at the one time, the horse had toes. That's a big deal. Short legs, and it had toes for maybe grabbing. Was it able to climb trees? Did it have like little appendages? Well, anyway, shortly, those toes, there were 4. Now they're 3. Okay, now look, the big one in the middle is moving out. These 2 are slimming down, and now you just have one giant hoof. Okay, and of course it's getting bigger and bigger. If evolution is consistent, this thing should be as big as a house, although we don't see it today. We call horse equus. Okay, now to talk about artificial selection, I must have seen this question come up, fool the kids all the time. This is not adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is the example we saw with Darwin's finches, where you have a common ancestor and then it branches out. Okay, into like 13 different species, 14 or whatever. One common ancestor population branches out to become many populations. Please don't think this for wild mustard. This was totally the farmer's idea. By cultivating different parts of the plant, we're able to cultivate a whole new vegetable. So for example, right, if we use the internode and we suppress its length and use the buds, we could get a cabbage, right? Or if we enlarge the leaves, we could get kale. And kale's like the new Hollywood leaf. It's supposed to be so healthy for you. In addition, if we get the lateral meristems and we enhance it, we can make kohlrabi. Now, if you're not sure about this, be aware of it, because rhubarb and all these other weird vegetables you should be aware of, okay? Because they'll give you examples and make you think. Cauliflower, okay? So if we had the flowers and we made them sterile, we can make cauliflower. Or if we just suppress flower development, we can make broccoli. Okay, and so this looks really nice. Another artificial selection, this is again where humans choose the best traits to go on, would be pesticide resistance in insects. DDT is one big example. We're also looking at PCBs. Read Rachel Carson's book on Silent Spring and you get a good update on this. And again, there's antibiotic resistant bacteria because of humans' overuse of of antibiotics, like especially penicillin. Once we figured out how good it works, like we would put it in soaps, we would put it in toothpaste, we were putting it everywhere, okay? And we were overusing it. We were even feeding it to the animals on the farms. And so when we drank the milk, that we found traces of antibiotic. Or when we ate meat, like cow, we found traces of antibiotics. So stay tuned. I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see antibiotic allergies on people, because chickens get it the most, yes? Okay, so now I want to just briefly go over the fossil record and evidence for evolution. The biggest one is the fossil record. These are real remnants of the past. Now, if you get lucky, you have a whole organism or a body fossil. That's where you get the complete organism. Or you might get trace fossils like molds and casts or footprints, or maybe you just might find a nest with the baby's bones in there, okay? We have comparative anatomy where we start to look at homologous structures, such as the bone structure, such as physical structures like, for example, if you external or internal development. Comparative embryology is another good one. When we do look at internal development, we want to actually see the embryos, and when you compare them, they look so similar, it's freaky. And then finally, comparative biochemistry. We're going to compare nucleotide sequences, right? ACTG, right? I'm also going to want to compare amino acid sequences like methionine, lysine, glycine, and so forth. If there's proteins, I want to look at the amino acid sequence and see how closely related, like the hemoglobin of a human and the hemoglobin of like a chimpanzee. So looking at fossils and the fossil record, preserved remains and traces. Okay, here we're looking at a trilobite. I got a T-Rex here, some primitive bony fish. Maybe this was the trilobite. I always get them confused. All right, body fossils, amber, ice. There's carbon film that we saw. Like, for example, that fish was carbon filmed. Imprint and molds and casts. And so this is where we go really nice on this, all right? Like, for example, in Colorado, we found this awesome dinosaur bones over here. And it's a complete skeleton. You could probably get a few $1 million for this thing. And the other one was from the Natural History Museum in New York City. Amber is a great one because it's a sticky sap. It traps the insects. It hardens. And then when it does, you have like a perfect preserved specimen. We actually pour amber on scorpions and other arachnids and then sell them as jewelry in gift shops. In addition, ice fossils. Now, I'm not sure how real this one is, but this is supposed to be the rendition of the woolly mammoth that they found in Siberia. This was around, I want to say, 1999, 2000. Okay, they actually found the Inuits, the Eskimos, had like all these tusks. Right? Scientists say, hey, where did you get those tusks? Say, hey, come over here, I'll show you. When he showed him, he was like, I know they were an elephant tusks because they were so big. I knew that these guys found a mammoth, or they found some mammoth graveyard. And there was a huge one, and one of them was actually intact. They used blow dryers to melt the ice. They were able to grab the hair. It was a really astounding moment. Carbon film leaves a stain, but you know what? I could tell a lot from this picture. I can look at the details. I can see the bone structure. I can see the scales, the rib, and so forth, where the gills are. All right, this carbon film of this plant, it gives me some information. Maybe this plant was seeded, but I could definitely see its vascular tissue and the way the veins move. In addition, molds and casts. I might not have the organism, but I got an imprint of it, and that's pretty big. And this is where minerals replace. Like, so a cast would be just the hollow shape of it, and the mold would actually be a full, like a three-dimensional solid piece of it, okay? Not just the imprint, but the actual solid piece. Okay, and then comparative anatomy. I love this picture because it color coats the 4 bones in the arm. We got the humerus in purple, right? In orange, we have the radius. In beige, we have the ulna. Yellow is going to be our carpals or our wrist. Okay, and then we have our metacarpals moving up closer to the hand, and then finally the phalanges. Each one of these, the human, the cat, the whale, and the bat, all have these structures. But they're used to different things. So homologous structures, very quickly, same structure, different function, evidence of a common ancestor somewhere. Look at the embryos. Now, usually what I would do is I would show the class and I would cover these embryos, right? And I want you just to look at the first layer. What? I can't even tell what these are. Don't tell me that's the human. Yes, it is. Well, it looks just like the pig at the embryo stage. Now, even when it gets over here, they still look the same. So we look very weird. This is a human in this picture. This looks like an alien. It does not look like a human being at all. Okay, so why are the embryos so similar? I heard that nature keeps what works. And so this structure or format for building a baby might be the best way. And so all across the vertebrate lineage, they all share it. Okay, amino acid sequences as I'm seeing here. I'm just looking at the amino acid sequence for hemoglobin. We're looking at a human, a horse, a gorilla, chimp, and I'm only looking at like the first 4 amino acids. Scientists really would look at like the entire chain, but hemoglobin's so big it's like 10,000 amino acids long. So you definitely don't want to look at all of it, but see where the changes are. I'm already seeing a whole bunch of changes between the horse and the human. Okay, I already see 3 changes and so forth, and that's what scientists would do in order to build like some sort of phylogenetic tree. Okay, and then finally the return to the sea. We believe that there were some organisms, mammals, that got so big that they decided to go back to the sea and really, use their lungs there, more space and everything else. Just as like the hippo was a great example. There were some dinosaurs that did the same thing. They breathed air, had lungs, and yet they went back to the sea. Okay, guys, and so this concludes our lecture on natural selection. Okay, in our next lecture, we're going to go even further and go into the word gene pool and start to show you that evolution really is just a change in allele frequency, change in the gene pool. And remember, guys, evolution only happens with populations, right? Individuals cannot evolve. It's a trap. In addition, Darwin never said anything about mutations, so if I see anything in Darwin and mutations, I'm going to cancel it out. One more thing, Darwin never said anything about inheritance of acquired characteristics or use and disuse. That was Lamarck. Okay, guys, so this concludes today's lecture. I'll see you next time. We're going to do evolution of populations in lecture 3. Be safe.